Good evening. Thank you for coming to tonight's event. We apologize for a delay. Tonight's event will focus on Gouverneur State School and the Willowbrook story. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm an urban policy analyst and a co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee here at CSI. It is my honor to host this event, and I'm so pleased with the turnout. Over 200 of you registered for tonight's event. This event is part of the Year of Willowbrook programming. Tonight's event will feature discussion among Jose Rivera, Willie Goodman, and Professor Jorge Matos, and tell how Willowbrook residents were sent to a condemned hospital to die and the fight to save them. Before we continue with our program, there are some housekeeping rules I would like to go over. Everyone will be muted during the event, except the speakers. After the panel discussion, we will answer some of your questions. We will try to answer as many of them as possible. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab throughout the evening, and Professor Lavender will read them out in the question period at the end. Just want to let you know that this event is also a closed captioning available by pressing the CC button on the bottom of your screen. It is my honor to introduce Catherine Lavender, co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee. She's also director of the Women's Center and Sexuality Studies Program, director of the Bertha Harris Women's Center, and an associate professor of history at the College of Staten Island. Please welcome Professor Lavender.
Thank you so much, Nora. I'm really happy to be here tonight. So I'll just say up front that there's some sad news, which is that Willie Goodman is unable to be with us tonight. She had a kind of last moment emergency that she needs to deal with. She's fine, everyone's fine, but she's just unable to join us tonight. So unfortunately, we won't hear from her, but we will have Jose to try to share with us some of her story, since Jose goes back a long time with Ms. Goodman. So I'm very happy to welcome you all to this event. This is something that I've been hoping that we could do for quite a while. It's to tell part of the story of Willowbrook that often doesn't get told. And it's about the moment, even before the consent decree, when families and parents and the Parents Association came together to use the law to fight for the rights of their loved ones who were sent to this condemned site without any respect for the possibility of their having long lives. I'll tell you at the front, because I need to cling to some of these more positive outcomes, that many of those who were sent to Gouverneur and were supposedly only going to be living for another year or so, many of those people are still alive today thanks to the efforts of their families. So that's an important thing for me to think about. It can be pretty sad to think about some of these stories, to know that many of them are still alive, including Willie Goodman's daughter, Marguerite, are still alive and well today, is a very important part of our story. So I'm very happy to introduce the two people who will be speaking tonight. Jose Rivera, who has lived this story from his childhood until the present. Currently, he's the Director of Quality Assurance at Cerebral Palsy of Nassau County in New Jersey, but he's also the brother of a Gouverneur resident named Luis Rivera, who unfortunately passed away. But in advocating for his brother, who was just within a year of his age, and as an important conduit between his mother, whose English skills were a difficulty as she navigated this world, he became the translator for that family and became very involved in the fight for his brother. He became an activist and a member of the Parents Association from his teen years in the 1970s. And he then went on to have a career of advocacy on behalf of people with disabilities. So he's really quite a hero, and I'm really happy that we're going to have him here to speak to us tonight about the story that he lived and that his brother and his family lived, and also to share with us the ways in which Goody really shaped him as a young person, as his adoptive mother, and turned him into the activist and advocate fireball that he became and still is today. So very happy to have Jose with us. And in addition, we're very honored to have Jorge Matos Vaidehuli, who is one of the, I'm very happy to be able to read his scholarship. I feel like he's filled in so many gaps in the story that I know have existed for a long time, really to make a much clearer picture of what was going on for many of the residents at Willowbrook, but also at Gouverneur. So Jorge Matos is an assistant professor and a reference librarian at Hostos Community College in the City University of New York. I first learned about him by reading an excellent article that he wrote in 2019, which is a study of the role of race in the fight for disability rights and focusing on Willowbrook, which he published in the Activist History Review. I really recommend it. I'll put the link to it in the chat. I put the link on the Eventbrite page, and I really think everyone should read it. Everybody who has any interest in the history of disability rights, and especially in the story of Willowbrook. He also has a forthcoming article coming out in this fall that focuses on Gouverneur. So I'm hoping he can share some of his insights from that research with us today. I can't wait to read that as well. So I'm one of his fans. So he's going to be telling us a bit about the historical context and putting this into this larger historical pattern that emerges, and we can understand the personal stories against that larger historical context in a really new and exciting way tonight. So very happy about that. So I will just very briefly say as background that the story of Gouverneur is the story of the transfer of a group of around 200 residents who were at Willowbrook in an attempt by the state to deal with overcrowding. They chose those residents who they felt had the greatest needs and who had really the way they communicated it to the family was the starkest outcomes, the least likelihood of a healthy life. And they then sent them to a building that had been condemned by the city in the 1960s when it had been a hospital. And in that place, they sort of expected them to languish and pass away. But what came out of that is a very different story. It's a story of the building of solidarity among the staff and the families, of the families coming together, spending time with their loved ones, providing care for them, and in that moment, really learning what they could do together, forming the Parents Association, and then that leading to a legal fight that predates the consent decree that pushed for the closing of Willowbrook, and really was an important landmark in the establishment of clear legal rights for people with intellectual and physical disabilities. So I'm going to turn it over to Jose, just with that little bit of background for people, to tell us about that story. And I'm going to ask him to tell us about how his brother, how Luis came to be sent to Gouverneur. And if you can put that into a context, that would be great. Oh, you're muted, Jose. I maybe need to.
I'm muted. Well, first of all, thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the committee for the work and the opportunity to be able to share our story, a story that's unique in terms of the history of the whole deinstitutionalization effort. If I may, just two clarifications or corrections, if I may, in your introductions. The organization I work for is CP of Nassau County, located in Roosevelt, Long Island. And the other part of it is that the heroes are not I, but rather someone like a Miss Goodman, who battle and fight over her life in devotion to her daughter, and others like her daughter. Miss Goodman fought for my brother and 199 other individuals at Gouverneur. She's the true hero, along with the individuals whose lives we fought to survive and ensure had fruitful meaning. So to your question, the Gouverneur parent group came into being almost by accident back in the 1960s, New York State, in anticipation of the overcrowded conditions that existed in Willowbrook State School at the time, where you were now exceeding 5,000 plus individuals in terms of the total census of those residing in Willowbrook. New York State made a conscious effort to select certain individuals from that total population. And they identified approximately 200 or so very profoundly disabled, multiply handicapped individuals. And those individuals then became a group of individuals that were gradually transferred, quietly, I may say, with no notice to the families, out of that facility out in Staten Island, Willowbrook State School, and moved to this building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a building formerly that served as the hospital, known as the Gouverneur Hospital on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, abandoned by New York City the year before, in 1961, if I recall correctly, because of structural issues. The building was considered to be dilapidated and outdated, built in the 1800s. I mean, really, the city of New York felt it was a building that they could not sustain. Boarded it up, and I think then the following year, New York State, the Department of Mental Hygiene, in its infinite wisdom, thought, let me deal with this overcrowded situation in Willowbrook. Let's select these people, and by virtue of their disabilities, the thought was they wouldn't live too long. And most estimates were 2 to 3 years is what the expectation was by the professionals at the time, so-called professionals, I should say, and place these individuals in this building. They spruced it up a bit, I guess, gave it some whitewash in terms of the paint, and place these individuals there. And with that, families, a lot of my families, including my own, traveled. My parents lived in the Bronx. Take the train, take the ferry to Staten Island, take the bus, and get over at the stop at Victory Boulevard, and go and visit my brother Louis. On Sundays were the visiting hours. Between 1 and 3 were the standard hours, dictated by the state at the time. And it's at that time when we would go and show up, as did a lot of families at Willowbrook, is when we became aware and were told, or your child or your relative is no longer here. Your individual has been moved to this place on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, referred to as Gouverneur. This is where you'll find them. And that's how families became aware of the move. So it speaks to just the total lack of disregard, the lack of insensitivity, the fact that there was no real consideration of families and the roles that they played. That became kind of the introduction, and a lot of families were dealing with and exposed to in their trying to appreciate the part that they played in the life of their loved one. So at Gouverneur, once these families were now assigned to this building, the visiting hours were still Sundays between 1 and 3. You weren't allowed onto the wards, much like was the practice at Willowbrook State School. In fact, you were limited to the corridors in terms of visitations. And I know that we have a collection of some still photos that'll show some of that for the audience. But those Sundays became an opportunity to connect with other family members, an opportunity to share stories, to catch up. I was a year younger than my brother, so my brother was placed in Willowbrook State School at the age of 5. I was 6. Louis was moved over to Gouverneur a year or so after being at Willowbrook, so I was 7. He was 6. But on those Sundays, I would spend time playing with the other kids in front of the building, or visiting with my brother. And families had an opportunity to connect and get to know each other, get to know each other's challenges, and really to become a support group, I think, is what led to some of the foundation and the connection that ultimately led to the organization of the Parent Association. And then as the years progressed on and we continued to confront the challenges, the recognition that the children, our individuals, were not getting the therapies they required, the visible signs of the deformities, contractures that became evidence with the lack of therapy, the fact that our children, most if not all of them, did not have a wheelchair. Cripple carts was the only form of transport available to them. So while we were no longer in Willowbrook State School physically, Willowbrook State School continued in its practices, in the mindset of the bureaucrats in charge of Gouverneur, and we were still subject to the same neglect, if not a more obvious neglect of our individuals, because now we were a smaller group forced to confront the realities of what we were not getting. Our individuals got basically custodial care. And so that hands-on staff that direct care worker became an important link to that family member. I know in my mother's case, um, that person was the one she wanted to be closest to continue to gauge how things were, how was Louis being cared for, um, and that direct care worker became really the other hero in the story of Gouverneur. And it's through that hands-on staff person that a lot of our individuals remained alive and survived the neglect that was inherent in Gouverneur by virtue of just the lack of therapies and therapeutic interventions as individuals became more and more disabled.
And, you know, I remember from stories that you've told me about how close those relationships came between the caregivers and the families. They became like partnerships. And I think that's an interesting angle that I don't often hear about. We often hear about the ways in which Willowbrook was terribly underfunded and understaffed. And that's clearly the same at Gouverneur. But I think there's much, it seems the way you tell it, there's more direct interaction with those caregivers. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, that at one point you were telling me, and we'll see this in the images, that the family members and the caregivers were often right next to each other during those visiting hours. That they were talking about the resident together as a kind of team. Whereas at Willowbrook, the residents were often brought out of the ward, off the ward. And so that caregiver might not be present during the visiting hours, and the family wouldn't have a chance to really get to know the caregiver who was working with the resident. And since your brother had both of those experiences, I think that's maybe why you recognize that distinction. And it really seems to have been an important distinction. I mean, I think at Willowbrook, we've heard a lot about the doctors, Dr. Bronston, Dr. Wilkins, the social workers, Mrs. Lee, Elizabeth Lee, being really important connections with the families. But it seems like even just every person on the floor in Gouverneur was having those connections with families. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, an important and a vital part. The staff were faced to confront the realities that families were faced to confront, as they were asked to do and to meet the needs of the individuals with little to no supplies or equipment. At times, the ratios of the staff to resident assignments were just unmanageable, and so that staff person, that hands-on staff, certainly had a sympathetic ear when it came to the families, and so it's by definition that where there is an interest in that hands-on staff person to want to do the right by that individual who's helpless and who's totally dependent. Um, that's the same concern that that family member has. People forget that in the case of my brother, my brother suffered from grand mal seizures that were uncontrollable, and the doctors essentially told my parents the decision was either you can keep him at home, in which case he'll probably live a short life with the love of family, or you institutionalize him in this place called Willowbrook State School. So in my parents' case, they felt they couldn't selfishly deny Louis an opportunity to live and to receive the therapies and the care that we were told he would get in the so-called state school, quote unquote. When in fact that was a lie. That was not what
Right.
Louis got. But the fact is, my parents would have preferred keeping Louis at home with us. No parent would have ever, if they were able to provide for their child, especially a child in such need, place them in the hands of a state bureaucracy, in the hands of strangers, who they now have to go out and establish some sort of a bond, a connection, a familiarity. They have to go and during each visit, feel and be reassured that, yeah, I'm looking out for your child. Don't worry, I've got your child's back. So that's a decision that to this day still is a challenge for a lot of our families. So I happen to have been exposed to that early on in my years because I saw the pain in my parents. I saw the struggle in my parents whenever visiting hours would end. And my brother Louis, you could just see after he was smiling and enjoying those 3 hours of visits, suddenly became very sad and somber. And I would have to go and jump around and act like a clown and a fool to get him to start to laugh so that we can separate from him,
Yeah.
so that we can see a smile on the face and be able to step away. My heart hurts just to even say that. It's an emotional moment for us, but that's part of how we manage the situation. And that hands-on staff person became our support, the person we could hopefully trust was looking out for our loved one, because we
Yeah.
knew the bureaucracy didn't care.
Right. Whereas the person who had physical contact often was the person who did care in the time between the visiting hours. And that's an important part of the story that we often kind of gloss over. So I know you were featured in this film, Unforgotten. You have the poster behind you on the wall.
Yes.
And we have a short clip from that I think we might want to share. So is it a good time to show it now?
Sure.
Okay. And then we have the slides to share, so you can talk about those as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
You know, there have been moments where I felt jealous, I felt angry, and I've tried to, in certain ways, express that to my mom, because I think it's something she doesn't realize, takes for granted. I think she expects for us to understand, and so with that expectation, it's a non-issue as far as she's concerned. She assumes we all understand. But I think at times I try to point out to my mom that, yes, Louis does require a lot from all of us. But it should not necessarily mean that we should neglect or ignore the fact that we all, as her children, require also some attention as well. And we're all, in certain ways, there's a little selfish side to all of us. But I think all of us, Jimmy, my sister, myself, put things in perspective, because the bottom line is that we have the ability to express ourselves and advocate for ourselves, whereas Louis doesn't. From that, we draw understanding, hopefully.
You know, I love all my song, but I noticed I put a special for him because it's different. He can walk, he can talk, he can eat. And, ¿cómo se dice? Le tengo un amor con más pena.
She says she feels a special love with him, with a certain degree of pity.
I remember also when I put in Willowbrook, you know, he passed too much. ¿Cómo se dice? Sufrimiento.
When he was in Willowbrook,
Yes, that's what happened. My other kid all the time with me. And he passed too much. That's I put, but I love all my kids. I don't want nobody jelly because he passed too much when he's small. I remember when he's with me, he lived with me 5 years. I remember my son in my big apartment walk in the walk chair.
the walker.
Walk all this and very, very, ¿cómo se dice? Active. And when I put my son in Willowbrook, for what? For that. So that's what happened with me. I put special attention. Somebody killed my son because he can eat fast. My son can eat fast. He had a feeding too. Why? Because he can eat fast. And that's what happened. That's what happened. I come every day here because I don't trust nobody now because I passed too much. Sorry, my son, but I love all my sons. But what's happened with me?
That's so powerful. I mean, your mother so well expresses the incredible agony of trying to take care of all of her children and the intense need of Louis
Yeah,
and how to balance that and the guilt of it, right?
absolutely. I chose that word jealousy purposely. there are the three boys. You just saw the three boys. We have a sister who wasn't present at the time of that filming. But I always concerned myself with the youngest Jimmy, who was on the side of my brother Louis, and the fact that Louis required all the attention that we had to give because of his need. And I always worried about what was going on in my younger brother's mind. And so my use of those words was to try to instigate commentary from him, instigate any sentiments, any opinions. Unfortunately, Jimmy chose not to bite, and the reverse occurred. My mother became emotional at the choice of words I threw out, and my brother Louis, as you could see when the camera panned towards him, had a kind of very sad look about him because he was my brother, God bless him, despite his disabilities, well aware of his world around him and his environment, and I think that was something that inspired me to want to do for him. But yes, I think it's a challenge that a lot of families who have other children struggle with, and sometimes I wonder to what extent are they cognizant of that. I knew growing up and speaking in front of other siblings, where I hear from parents um, that they prefer not to involve or impose any expectations on their other children in advocating or caring for their disabled sibling because they didn't want to impose that responsibility on them. That was the responsibility they felt it was the parents, not the siblings. I was of the opinion, or I should say, I was raised by my parents. My mother and my father made clear to us that the fact that Lou was placed outside of the home did not mean we weren't responsible for Louis. Did not mean we had an obligation to Louis. In fact, they made it a business of ensuring that my brother Jimmy would go on one Sunday, as they alternated. My parents would alternate business. My brother would go with my mother, and the following Sunday I would go with my father. The point was to make sure that the brothers didn't forget that they had a brother who was disabled, who while not living at home with us, still was our family member that we needed to keep an eye out for and advocate for. So that family dynamic was crucial and critical to, I think, the survival of the family unit.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, yeah, there are stresses and strains. That's inherent in having an individual with disabilities. It's how you manage those stresses and those strains, that will ensure people walk out of there whole and complete and feeling like they've contributed to that loved one, that disabled individual. I often worry about those siblings who were not expected to play a part in their brother or sister's life, and their parents are no longer around, and now they're not so clear as to what to do and how to best advocate for them, may not be as familiar with what their needs are. So there's a disservice that you do when you don't expose that sibling, that child,
Right.
to
When you
this other family member. Yeah.
right, you're protecting them from that, but they're also then they're cut off from the healing of it.
Absolutely
So
right.
I think could we look at the slides together of those visiting days and you could talk a
Sure.
bit about that? Okay,
Sure.
I want to share those images. Sorry. So I'll just give a tiny bit of background. These are photographs taken by a photographer named Nancy Sterles, and we're very lucky to be able to have these images, which are the prints of which were given to the archives of the College of Staten Island by Jose, who's had them in his possession for the last 40 years or so. But they're actually owned by a gallery, and you'll see the credit. So if you're interested in seeing these, and we're interested, there might be possibly more images like this that we might be able to see in the future. That information is here in the slides. So I'm just going to let you talk about them and tell me
Sure.
when you want to go forward. Go ahead.
So this is a picture taken by the photographer, and in my opinion, she was showing a mural that was painted by a famous painter, as I understand it, on the wall of Gouverneur State School. And I think what the photographer Nancy was trying to show was illustrate the kind of a children's nursery rhyme juxtaposed to the decay and neglect of a building, as evidenced by the recently applied plaster yet to be painted, and the stains on the floor. And underneath it, there's a wheelchair of one of the Gouverneur residents. So I think that the point that the photographer is making, but there's actually a hole just behind the larger wheel of the wheelchair up against the wall, was to show how the building was so neglected in its appearance. And yet there's a children's nursery rhyme, I guess, depicting a much happier time, a much livelier time for children, but the reality of what the building reflected.
Yeah.
So this is your typical Sunday afternoon visits. This is the fourth floor ward, the corridor, I should say. And these are families, as you can see, limited. These are the cripple carts. And the far right is actually my brother Jimmy and my mother and my brother Louis, whose back is towards you, in a specially created wheelchair that we managed to secure for him and fight for because Louis suffered from scoliosis of the spine, and we saw that scoliosis was just getting progressively worse. And so this was our way. Crippled carts, as you see with the other individuals, was only further contributing to disability and the deformities that a lot of our individuals struggle with. So this is your typical Sunday afternoon, visiting hours, as I said, between 1 and 3. Here's another section of the Gouverneur State School facility and a family member with their loved one visiting. Again, a moment to reconnect with your child, with your loved one, is what a lot of us witnessed. And certainly I think Nancy tried to capture that in her photos. One of our Gouverneur residents sort of sitting idle. In the background is a mirror. There was a program referred to as the foster grandparent program, which was unique in that the state director at the time accessed and made a connection with some senior citizens in the area from a nursing home or local, and they were able to come in and spend time with some of the individuals who may not have had families involved. And so this was certainly unique and beneficial for both populations. This is a young lady who I remember first name was Maureen. And Maureen was someone who always blow kisses at you. She was very, very affectionate. And Maureen, I think he was showing off her painted fingernails. I think she was very proud of her painted fingernails.
Oh, wait, sorry, I skipped one. There you go.
Another one of our individuals. This picture to me is one of the more significant pictures of taken by the photographer. It clearly shows the neglect and the obvious deformity that can result from the lack of therapy, the lack of proper therapeutic interventions. And so what you have here is clearly an indication, I think, from the photographer's perspective of what we were all experiencing. This is emblematic of what Gouverneur became known as a place that children were sent to die and not provided with the needed services and supports that they required, and became the cry for the Gouverneur parent group.
And I think the image was that these were people who were not going to interact in any way, so they didn't need to be interacted with, but there's so many of these photographs are so expressive.
Yes.
Of connection, of people trying to make a connection. It's very powerful. Sorry, go ahead.
Again, an individual who was always very happy despite the situation that she was living under. This, in my opinion, was the institutional sort of alignment of individuals who waited to be bathed. They were stripped down to their undergarments, I think, in preparation for bathing. Your typical institutional type practices at the time. And this is another gentleman, one of the foster grandparents, showing affection, demonstrating a connection with one of the Gouverneur residents who in all likelihood had no family member. And so I think, again, this particular union relationship was significant for both individuals. And here, again, spending time with the individuals. You could see the hands bandaged for this individual, indicative of possible self-abusive tendencies, either mouthing or biting or striking his hands. And so the way they dealt with that, again, given the lack of any kind of therapeutic interventions, was to bandage the hands.
This is another foster
Another-
grandparent.
Another foster grandparent
Yeah.
sharing an intimate moment with one of the Gouverneur individuals.
What's interesting is how many people kept their coats on.
Well,
Must have been cold, right?
No, that's kind of a smock or like a jacket.
Oh,
It's
okay.
part of the uniform. I think
Oh,
that they wanted to sort of have as reflective of their position.
Mm.
And I'm sure it was cold, by the way.
Mhm.
This is a picture of an individual's personal items displayed on a windowsill. You can see the background. It was snowing. Snowfall.
And that's it. So we just wanted to thank Terrain Gallery for letting us use those images and the archives for making scans for us to be able to share them. And the photographer's name is Nancy Sterles, and she passed away in 1984. So pretty amazing images. It's wonderful to have them. Okay. So we're going to come back and talk more with you, Jose, about the way in which all of this shaped you and turned you into the advocate that you became, and how Ms. Goodman also was part of that training for you. But I also wanted to ask Jorge Matos to give us some context and some historical background, because there's some amazing things going on in this moment that are playing out that may not be recognizable to the people who are living through that history, but it really helps to understand that. So let me turn it over to Jorge.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, I want to, thank everyone who's with us tonight. There are a few luminaries with us, from the Willowbrook Parents campaign. So it's really an honor. Well, before I sort of, dovetail into the social history, what was going on in the city. One of the questions that I asked myself when I started researching the history of Willowbrook was, why were there so many youth of color in the archival record, but such a lack of acknowledgement of the issue of race in the historical scholarship? And it wasn't until 2016, until Professor Darrell Hill, College of Staten Island, did a groundbreaking article about the issue. He did a study of death records, and he's with us tonight, so that's also an honor. But this issue was the issue of race and class were some of the activists that were involved in the Willowbrook campaign. They were aware of these issues, but there were a number of historical and political decisions that, why this issue wasn't as pronounced as I've been researching, right? And some of those activists were, for example, as we have here tonight, Dr. Bronston, Michael Wilkins, Murray Schnapps, and I'll sort of demonstrate how Murray Schnapps was very aware of the situation at Gouverneur. And last but not least, Geraldo Rivera. Geraldo Rivera makes reflection in a book right after the expose 1972, sort of, and that's in my article, right, outlining what he understood to be also the racial and class dynamics of what was happening in Willowbrook. And Gouverneur, for example, most of the residents were actually of Black and Puerto Rican background. And as I'll discuss, there are some historical reasons for that at that particular moment. One of the things that I've been trying to sort of advocate for is that one cannot divorce Willowbrook from the social and historical context of what's happening in New York City post-World War II. And I think I'll read just a very brief quote from Murray Schnapps that'll sort of give you a thrust of what sort of what's happening, and that he sort of he captures it in these interviews, and then also in his memoirs before he passes away a few years ago. And
before you say that, Jorge, I'm sorry. For those who may not know who Murray Schnapps was, could you just really quickly contextualize?
Oh yes,
him?
I'm very sorry. Yes, I
okay.
forgot. Yes, I
I mean, most of us know, but
Jose and I, yeah. So Murray Schnapps, first of all, Murray Schnapps was a Jewish American attorney from Brooklyn, and him and his wife were very active in the Willowbrook Parents campaign to abolish Willowbrook, right? The years-long campaign. Murray Schnapps was the attorney for the Gouverneur Parents Association, and he's the one that takes the first case in 1971, in April 1970, to get an injunction to stop the state from removing children from Gouverneur and sending them back to Willowbrook, which, as many of the parents at Gouverneur saw, was a death sentence, right? And this is in the context of massive budget cuts that were occurring at the state level for the Department of Mental Hygiene. They made a decision to close a number of different institutions throughout the state, and Gouverneur was on that list, right? But this is a Murray Schnapps quote, and I should add that he had a daughter in Willowbrook, a young daughter by the name of Rivera. Unfortunately, I was to interview Murray Schnapps right before he passed away, but I didn't make it down to Florida. But I did get to meet him, and that was also a privilege. Murray Schnapps, this is a quote from an interview, I believe it was in the 1980s, said, "There was a little hospital in Manhattan known as Gouverneur on the Lower East Side. Gouverneur housed a couple hundred profoundly, quote unquote, retarded Black and Puerto Rican children. They were all sent there from Willowbrook. My conclusion was, and nobody's ever challenged me, that they were sent there to die." Right. So this is definitely, as Jose was saying, this is part of a battle cry. They were, the parents were very aware of why they were sent there. Right. The Gouverneur story, interestingly enough, is central, I would say, to the Willowbrook Parents campaign to abolish the institution. If anything, the Willowbrook Parents campaign, and in the story of Gouverneur, is an example of one of the most important multiracial political coalitions in the city, despite the racial tension. There were a number of developing social movements in the late 60s and throughout the 60s and 70s that were led by Black and Puerto Rican Latino communities. This was a very different in terms of the, sort of the composition and the coalitions that were formed. It didn't mean that there wasn't racial tension from within, right? I don't want to romanticize. But at the same time, I think that at least from the leadership and the Willowbrook Parents, there was a very strong consciousness of maintaining that unity for the purpose of the purpose they were trying to achieve, right? So the historical and social background, the most important, the most glaring, is that post-World War II, there's a massive migration of Black and Puerto Ricans into New York City. It radically reconfigures the demographic map of the city. And there's a large white flight that is taking place. It's taking place throughout the country in many urban centers with the rise of suburbanization. Just to give you an understanding of the significance of this, by the 1960s, New York City has the largest Black urban community in the United States, as well as the largest Puerto Rican a community in the United States, with almost 500,000 Puerto Ricans coming within a 20-year period after the World War II. So it's a massive dislocation, right, of people from other parts of the country and from an American colonial territory in the Caribbean. This is a very important thing to understand because it affects the kind of composition of residents in Willowbrook. Right, and I'll demonstrate how that was noted by state authorities later on. The social history that surrounds this migration is one where these communities were facing severe rampant discrimination, unemployment, deterioration of housing, large concentrations of these communities in some of the poorest sections of the city, large levels of disinvestment, which lead to very poor health outcomes and services being provided to these communities, right? Which is connected to issues around disability, right? And how communities are disabled, right? And also police repression. And this is also connected, as I will show later, with how Puerto Rican youth were funneled into Willowbrook, right, through the courts, right? The best example of this major historical shift in New York is Jose and Willie Mae. Willie Mae was a migrant, post-war migrant from North Carolina with the Black migration, the great Black migration to the north. And Jose, right, Jose's mother and parents came in the 1950s, right? So they're emblematic of a massive populational shift in New York, right? And even more to the point, Gouverneur was in the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side is a neighborhood that has also a very large populational shift, being from a traditionally Eastern European, Jewish community, and as well as other European migrants. By the 1950s and 60s, it has transformed into one of the largest Puerto Rican neighborhoods in the city, right? So that all of these things are sort of interconnected, right? The other thing that's really important, this period is as I was saying earlier, it's a period of massive social movements within some of these communities, and that influences the Gouverneur Parents Association. Willie Mae Goodman discusses it in her interview. She's very clear, right? She articulates and deploys that in different ways, right? She was very aware of what's going on in the city by some of these in areas of education and other social struggles by these communities, right? And it's also an influence on the Willowbrook Parents, just as they were influenced by the social movements going on throughout the country, across race and across class, right? But the most important thing that really sort of demonstrates, and this has not really been sort of researched enough, and this is one of the things that I came across, was the famous, little known, unfortunately, 1960 study on the institutionalization of mentally retarded individuals. The study is done by the state. It commissions a group of researchers to do this study on who's being institutionalized during the 1950s, right, in New York City, to three main state schools. That is Willowbrook, Letchworth Village, and Wasaic State School. And what does it find? Well, it finds that there's a disproportionate institutionalization of Black and Puerto Rican and Latino children, especially within the criminal justice system, the manipulation of IQ scores, and poor record keeping of IQ tests. Many children are funneled into the institution without even having an IQ score. They're supposed to have an IQ score below a certain average, right, to officially meet the diagnosis of being disabled, right? So it's a haphazard system. It's a catch-all system. And Darrell Hill, beautifully documents that in his 2016 article. One of the main findings in the article, and this is connected to Gouverneur, it finds that more than half of severely disabled children are coming from Puerto Rico, and as they noted at the time, Puerto Rican and Negro families, even though they made up a quarter of the population. Puerto Rican children committed in particularly large numbers. These are severely disabled, right? This is for the severely disabled, right? And then the study also notes that many Puerto Rican families of severely disabled children feel pressured to commit their children due to the combination of poverty, the precarious living conditions, and dearth of treatment systems. As that I was telling Jose and Catherine the other day, many Puerto Rican families, and this study, it's an amazing study because it's rife with all kinds of anecdotes around the issue of race and class. Many Puerto Rican families thought of the state schools as country schools. In Spanish, we would say escuelas en el campo. That's something that's actually nice. So many Puerto Ricans that were coming from rural areas in the island, they probably had this must be idyllic, right? So that study is, I think, one of the most important in rethinking how we sort of analyze and talk about Willowbrook and its connection to issues of race and class in the city. And I will stop there. Thank you.
But that's such fantastic context, really, to understand that. It's really important. But I think for the people who are living it, maybe those patterns are not as immediately recognizable. I mean, I think it's relatively straightforward to think that perhaps it's just you. you as the new arrival in the city who doesn't know how to navigate in the system, or you as somebody who may have some language barriers getting in the way. And that might be why you got sent, instead of understanding that it's you as part of a larger group got sent, or your child was sent into this system. I mean, it is this prehistory of mass incarceration that we're talking about. It's pretty powerful. And it's just amazing to have that connected. So I want to ask Jose, did you see those forces playing out? I mean, I think at one point, I don't want to take words from your mouth, but you said to me, disability had no color. And maybe you could talk about that.
That is correct. You know, for us, there wasn't an opportunity or time to take note of what someone looked like. We were all in this same boat as it relates to the neglect that our individuals were experiencing, our disabled individuals. I'll take it a step further. It wasn't just what was being neglected in the state institutions. The communities were neglected. Our communities and the families of individuals who presented disabilities, a lot of the families kept those individuals, in some cases, locked up in their apartments. They were rarely seen. The supports just weren't there in the communities. So the institutions became emblematic of really what was a problem and a failure across society. So the institutions became that boiling point, in my opinion. But color was never a factor in our efforts to forge a union. In fact, that Lower East Side community, a lot of the organizations we work with, such as Two Bridges, the Educational Alliance, were entities that were established on the Lower East Side, support networks to those communities. A lot of them Jewish in their origins, became partners with us. They partnered with us, with those families in Gouverneur, and helped forge an alliance that's helped to further strengthen the cause of the Parent Association. So that in 1971, when Dr. Hammond, the medical director, issued that notice that Jorge had touched on, that Gouverneur needed to close because of budget constraints, and your kids was now being sent back to Willowbrook, our parents said no. We organized, mobilized, and elected Miss Willie Mae Goodman as the president of our group. Miss Goodman, who would visit her daughter every Sunday, basically kept to herself. Little to no interaction from what I remember of this lady at the time on Sundays. Suddenly became our leader. And through the efforts of Mary Schnapps, he gave us that legal muscle. And in 1971, as Jorge had touched on and mentioned, we were the first parent group, through Miss Goodman being the first plaintiff, to take the state of New York to court and win a court injunction, because the judge recognized that this was not in the best interest of the population to send them back to Gouverneur, to Willowbrook State School. But that then mobilized, that empowered that parent group with the resistance that we were able to also muster through the Young Lords and Black Panthers, and prevent state officials who threatened to come in the dead of night and board our kids onto buses against parents' wishes. So parents, with the help of these various community support networks, forged such a powerful group. The use of the media became another vehicle that parents we were pioneers in, reaching out to various radio shows, local newspapers, all of the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, were our vehicles to get our message out, and it became an effective tool. I was thrown into Ms. Goodman says, come with me and we're going to go visit the local church on a Sunday afternoon. I had no idea where we're going. And all of a sudden she says she developed laryngitis. Jose, can you go up and talk to the congregation about our children? In an effort to introduce, our kids were isolated and concealed from that community. And so the parents felt we need to get that community to know who our kids are, who are the people, human beings that are housed in this place, and the fact that we need their help. So our efforts were to force the state of New York to recognize the rights of our kids, their obligation to our individuals, force the state of New York to recognize that obligation all extended to the community as well. And that's what brought the Alliance on board, the Educational Alliance, the Two Bridges, the Henderson Settlement, another entity so that collaboration was, I think, in many ways a success. New York State, the Department of Hygiene felt, this is a formidable force that we can't mess with and easily intimidate our way, to insist upon our way. And so thus became the kind of struggle and the challenge with the help of Mary Schnapps, certainly legally, to be able to stand our ground and say, you need to do better for our individuals.
Well, and I think you have kind of pointed out that this is part of that story. And I've heard Willie Mae tell that story of her sort of blossoming into this radical activist. You know, that there was a moment where she sort of got so angry that it all came bubbling out of her, but then also that she makes other people blossom, saying to you, she has laryngitis, you have to go speak. She's always developing people around her, right? Pushing them up to be the people that lead and not just herself.
And she
I mean,
said
that's
that
one of the
very
things
same
that's
thing.
amazing.
She said that very same thing last night, coincidentally. She said,
Really?
a leader is someone, a good leader, she said, is someone who stands in the background and gets others to do for
Pushes
them.
people
So
forward.
now here I am in my 60s, and I've suddenly come to realize, oh, is that what was going on all along? You were kind of pushing me out there thinking I was doing something else, but in fact it was you manipulating. But to her credit, she remains highly regarded because she keeps her eye on the prize. This isn't about her daughter. This wasn't about my brother. This was about our children, and that is something that I hear from a lot of officials, and many a commissioner over her many years have expressed that appreciation of someone like a Miss Goodman, who was a parent who was not looking out for what's in it for my child, but rather what's in it for our kids.
Right.
That's what stands out in a Miss Goodman, and that's why she's the kind of formidable force at the age of 91 that she still is. God bless her.
Well, and also, I mean, the question of how you keep going, how you keep pushing against this immovable rock that obviously you moved. That's the thing, this immovable force. You guys did move it. You won that injunction. You did change the outcomes. These were not people who were gone after 2 years.
That's
You know,
correct.
they didn't just go there and die.
That's correct.
And, you know, you also, somebody has asked what becomes of Lewis later, and I think this might be a moment to tell that story. But you, beyond that, continued in this field, continued as an advocate. So it's not just your own family member.
Louis, in many ways, my brother Louis gave me my path in life. I've always said this was not a career I chose, but rather was chosen for me. Louis passed away, unfortunately, in 1996, shortly after the completion of the documentary Unforgotten, 25 years after Willowbrook. So when I was given a preview of that tape to see it at home, it had just been months that we had just buried Louis. So you can imagine the emotional reaction I had to seeing him on TV. But Louis passed away, unfortunately, because of the disabilities at the age of 40 or 39, if I'm correct. The disabilities and his health got the better of him, and I think that the moral to the story and what I learned, and my fight over his life was simply about ensuring that I would always say you never know when it's his time to go. So that means each day has to be lived to the fullest, and it is our obligation to ensure that each day is meaningful, is offering him some significance, some value. It would break my heart whenever we would go and visit, and we would just simply see him in the institution staring at the wall. That's all he would see was the wall. And so for us, the battle became about exposing our individuals. Miss Goodman's battle became exposing these individuals to the community, taking them out, letting them experience sunlight, fresh air. Let society get to see that there are people that are a little different than some of us are, that require a little more help, a little more assistance, a little more patience, that these individuals who appreciate the value of life is what I've gotten from my brother. Appreciate the value of life, no matter how challenging things might be before you. My brother's smile always reminds me of that, and the smile of others like my brother. they appreciate and cherish life.
And now it's going on into the next generation. I understand your
Yes.
daughter has been inspired by watching you
Yeah, I'm so
enter
proud of
her own public life.
my daughter Eliana. She's something else, but it brings a tear to my eyes that she's completed her first year at the American University. I don't know, a plug for AU, and she's chosen to pursue a career of political science. And in her documents, in her papers, in her applications, she's referenced my taking her at her when she was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old up to Albany to assist Ms. Goodman during the caucus meetings that we would have, legislative hearings and meetings, where we would, to Ms. Goodman's credit, try to ensure that there was always an agenda that included people with developmental disabilities and their families as part of the political dialogue that would take place annually during the Black and Hispanic and Asian caucus, legislative caucus that would take place in Albany. So I would take my daughter with me and my children, and she would hand out flyers and take attendance, but apparently she was sitting back and watching Miss Goodman speak, watching me. And that seems to have inspired her to want to pursue a similar career in life. God bless her.
Mhm.
So where do we go from here is a topic that I think certainly we should touch on. Things have certainly
Absolutely.
changed. We've evolved, but things are not necessarily still meeting the needs of families and individual disabilities. The new talk and the new concept is managed care. Managed care is something that I always refer to as it's a play with words. Managed care is in fact synonymous for managed money. Um, and 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 so where when Ms. Goodman and I, our efforts were our kids were had every right to get what they needed by way of services. Managed care puts a cap on that in many ways, and it's something families need to be aware of. Um, it's something you need to be on guard of because it may be that the budget that you're afforded through managed care may not allow you to get what you are in need of because that budget may not lend itself to. So there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes with regard to these new approaches that are being considered by government. And it just means parents need to continue to be vigilant and ever informed and involved in an effort to ensure um, that the needs of the disabled and individuals with disabilities aren't taken for granted, ignored, and put to the side for a more active, a louder voice that the needs of our individuals should be front and center always.
Well, and the thing that I feel I've learned most from hearing from the parents and the families who were the advocates who fought for the rights of people who were at Willowbrook is how important it was that they worked on it together. You know, they had those moments where they together went to see their children and experienced that shared experience. Even if it was each person's different, they had some common ground, and that was what the movement was built on. And when I look at what goes on now, I don't know how people who have, you know, IEPs, how do they meet other families and other parents who are going through the same kind of thing? It's so individualized now. They don't have that kind of bullpen experience that you saw in those photos where all the families were gathered around their family members, and you could have that conversation with the caregivers, and you could have conversations with other parents, and you could have Murray Schnapps get involved with, you know, with Goody's case, or then that goes on to build the case that happens among the Willowbrook parents. You know, I don't know where that's going to happen, and that fills me with some dread.
Sure.
Because I think those families really need to unite to fight as a group. I mean, many of these things are class actions, right? They're
Absolutely
groups.
right. One of the things that came out of the movement was a recognition that we were all in this together, and the word partnership became emblematic of the evolution of the service delivery system. The creation of an OPWD, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, a carve out from the Department of Mental Hygiene in an effort to ensure that it had its own budget, its own ability to establish its own priorities, became a significant achievement of the class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the Willowbrook plaintiffs. That partnership has eroded over these recent years, and I just don't feel that there's a recognition that the achievements that we've had over the past 40, 50 years came about because we worked together, both the families, the service providers, and the state of New York, hand in hand, with common goal, common vision. That's kind of gotten a bit disconnected, and I think has hurt that ability to continue to build on the progress and successes. So I think it's something that we need to continue to remind ourselves that partnership was vital to the successes we've achieved over the past 40, 50 years. And we need to revisit that.
Yeah, and it was part of a larger political organizing. It was a time of activism and people speaking out. And I think that there's these trends. So maybe people are a little more quiescent now. They keep it to themselves a bit more. That doesn't mean that the desire is not there. And many people have put in the chat organizations that are actively trying to build that kind of community where people can learn, like the National ARC. I'm just going to read out a couple of them. Autism Speaks is one that was mentioned, the Staten Island Developmental Disability Council, SIDDC, or borough-based developmental councils. There are those organizations, and I hope that we really will foster people's interest, and maybe people who never before thought about the need for that. That part of the whole year of Willowbrook is to create a space where we have these conversations and new people are brought in and introduced to each other and have this opportunity.
And to educate. I think there needs to be more in the form of education to hear some of our elected officials not even know what is Willowbrook. What do you mean Willowbrook? What is Willowbrook? That's a shame. Our elected officials should have a historical lesson and an introduction as to the evolution of our field and our industry. So there needs to be more done in that vein of educating our elected officials as to what our history was and where we were and how we've achieved what we've achieved and how we could lose some of that. There's a lot of choices families have today in some cases. We didn't have those choices back then. So there's a tendency sometimes to become a little complacent and to think that I'll always have those choices. Let me remind you, I come from a time where what we thought was secure and would always be there, don't become complacent.
That's right.
It could very easily be taken away.
Right. So we had one of the things we were going to turn to as we start to turning to answering questions from the audience and having a conversation there was, what were the things that were necessary to be successful? And I think you've laid out some of those things. It was a certain kind of personality, pugnaciousness, willingness to lead by pushing other people into the spotlight. So it's not just on you all the time. And that's clearly the lesson of Willie Mae Goodman's life, that the reflected glory is what lights her up, right? She lets the light shine on other people. And then that reflected light is what lights her up for the whole world to see. She's pretty amazing that way. But are there other things that you think are necessary that we need to know about? And I think here, Jorge, maybe you can add to this too. What kind of organizing do people need to be doing? How do we get the word out?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Jorge. Sorry.
No, sure. No, I what I wanted to point out to, for us not to forget, is that the same forces that were at work in Willowbrook during the 1950s and 60s are still at work today. And I think some of the comments about the nursing home industry and some other types of facilities, right? Murray Schnapps was always talking about this right up until he passed away, right? Sort of the dangers of, the new forms of institutionalization. And what I would add to that as well is that mass incarceration is very much linked to sort of race and disability. And that's something that we're living today. I mean, the high levels of this, men and women from Black and Latino communities and indigenous communities, and I would add for white communities that have disabilities are very, very high. Scholars in the field talk about how there's a pipeline from special education in high school right into prison. Right? So these forces are still at work, right? And they're all very much interconnected. I think we can't lose sight of that, right? I think that sometimes And there's always been a tension within the different movements within the disability rights, that there is a sort of a fear of, well, we can't associate with those people, right? And these are some of the, and this happened during the early disability rights, organizing. There was a real sort of tension between people with physical disabilities, people with developmental disabilities, and those that were seen as mentally ill. There were a lot of tensions, and they all have to do with particular cultural values that come out of an ableist society that sees people with disabilities as either, deficient, the problem, dangerous. And so these forces are still at work. And we always have to keep that in mind, that all of this is very much interconnected, right?
Definitely.
I think certainly one of the key ingredients is families should never feel as though they have to be careful about what they say for fear of insulting a bureaucrat, a state official. I think one of the things that Ms. Goodman was always known for was speaking poignantly and directly to the issue, making clear what was not her satisfaction and why, without fear of insult. I think too often in a lot of these state officials, many years later, have come to acknowledge Ms. Goodman as someone that, while they at first were intimidated and took offense to what she said, later on recognized that it wasn't personal. It was never intended to be personal. It was about advocating for your child. And I think all too often parents today are making things personal, or at least that official, that service provider might be taking it personal, when in fact it's that family member trying to advocate for their loved one. And I think certainly it's always about being respectful, but it's about letting know when you're upset and when you're angry. I would always say to my mom, when she would go and visit my brother and experience a situation where she was upset and unhappy, and she would wait to go home and call me, and I would say, Mom, I appreciate that you don't have a good grasp of the English language, but even in Spanish, if you let your anger and your feelings be known to that worker, they will know you're upset. And by the way, in doing that, you're also helping me. So it's not that you're waiting for me to call and make the complaint on your behalf. Voice your discontent then and there, and let them see. They'll know what a carajo is and a coño is in Spanish. They'll know that they can translate that into their own English version of what that might be.
Yeah.
So it was, again, something my mother was fearful. And I appreciate that with a lot of families. So they're afraid because they recognize that that child is under the care of someone else, that they don't want to irritate, annoy, anger, for fear that might be taken out of the. I appreciate that there's a way of approaching that ensures that I respect you and I trust that you'll do right for my child, but I have a concern. Help me address this concern and help me work. It offends me when I hear today, still, what I heard from Dr. Bronson in that letter that was sent to my mother in 1971. Your child is going to be sent to Willowbrook State School because we have to close Gouverneur. So
Wait, that wasn't from Dr. Bronston, that letter, was it? It was from a different
I'm sorry,
Hammond, wasn't it?
Dr. Hammond. I'm
Yeah, sorry, just
I was
making
reading,
sure.
I was reading Dr. Bronson's chat,
Right.
so my apologies, Dr. Bronson.
That's
I just
okay, we
happened to
fixed
reading
it.
the chat. Dr.
Yeah.
Hammond
Yeah.
and said,
Phew, that's right.
you have a choice to make. You can either accept your child going to Willowbrook, or you can take your child home.
Yeah, that's not a choice.
That's never a choice for families, even today.
Yeah.
For anybody to be saying to a family member, you don't like what we're providing or not providing your child, or how, take them home. How offensive and how insensitive. So it's about knowing how to work with people and respectfully, and achieve the best for that individual who's there by necessity, not by choice, necessity.
I just wanted to chime in, with Jose's recollections of the use of anger, right? The use of mothers and anger as a political weapon. In my interviews with Willie Mae, she was very clear with me, and she was very open with me that she deployed race in different ways as a strategic tool. She used the sort of sort of trope of the angry Black woman and throwing, lots of expletives and profanity at times. She knew that that was be effective in certain, polite society, right? And some of these, bureaucrats, white professional bureaucrats. So she was very clear about this. And how could you not be when you're in the United States? These are the racial realities. I mean, we shouldn't sort of try to hide from them. Having an honest conversation is uncomfortable, but at the same time, we're still united, right? I mean, this is exactly what it's about. We're always learning from each other. I'll give one anecdote that I found just, so hilarious with Willie Mae, that, one of the things that I note in some of my research is that Willie Mae also deployed some of these tactics against different Black and Latino politicians, right? How to sort of get them, on her side. And one of the things she did to the former Congressman Charles Rangel, who represented Harlem, as many of you know, for many years in Congress, she says that she put together an event. They gave him all these awards, but now he owed her, right? So without telling him, they do this event. I know Jose knows about this story, right? And so they give him all these plaques, these records. Oh, we love you so much, Charles. Please, but there was a political strategy behind that, right? And she was always very clear to me about that. And she also had her own tensions with sort of a new generation of Black and Latino bureaucrats within the mental health system who she felt, were not aware of the struggle that was happening. She was also very derisive of them as well. It was very clear, as Jose says, that she was very clear about who, she was struggling for, right?
But Charles Rangel came to her 91st birthday.
Oh yeah, well,
so he knew he better show up.
Exactly.
And then she did other stuff, like she would sit in people's offices for 8 hours if they
That's right.
That's right. So
That's
how
right.
do you say no to a mother who will give up her entire day waiting to see you?
Yeah.
So she played many different versions of who she was or who she is.
Sorry, Catherine.
It's okay.
The other thing I should say is that, for those, Jose's very aware of this, she had a very close relationship with Percy Sutton. Percy Sutton was the, Manhattan Borough president in the 1970s, also former attorney for Malcolm X. I mean, people in the community know that, right? The Apollo Theater, for goodness sakes, sort of a cultural landmark in the African-American community, right? And the interesting thing is that she also had a very close relationship with the editor of the Amsterdam News. And that was because they had grown up together in North Carolina, Bill Tatum, right? So she also was able to cultivate those sort of community relationships, once again, coming from the Black migration to the North, right? So all of these things are very much part of the story. I think it's noteworthy to discuss them tonight. So thank you for giving us that space.
I just wish she had been here to tell these stories herself, but it's good to get to tell them about her too.
Yeah.
She's so amazing. Well, I want to give a chance to some of the questions that have come in from the audience, and there's some really interesting ones. One is, at what point did the state realize that facilities needed funding to operate in more efficient capacity? And it's almost, when did the state figure that out? Has it figured it out?
I think that the lawsuit, the class action lawsuit, forced New York State to recognize that you had a disproportionate budgeting process when the lion's share of funds went to the psychiatric facilities, all under the Department of Hygiene, and a minor, whatever was left, went to the Development of Disabled. And again, the Judge Bartels at the time, insisting that two separate budgets be established, two separate bureaucracies, allowed for the state of New York to, through that separate, unique bureaucracy, OPWDD, OMRDD at the time, New York City County Service Group, historically speaking, forge ahead and start to deinstitutionalize and establish community-based services and shift those funds from those large scale facilities over into smaller settings, and the recognition that funds needed to be sufficient. By the way, today's times, um, current governors of as of late have failed to adequately fund those community-based service providers who've struggled over the years, and have in keeping up with the demands of the workforce and the needs of the individuals. The population is living longer. The individuals who are now in the communities are getting the kind of medical care that they were neglected for so long, and so that kind of good health care combined with a greater awareness of how to minimize the challenges that disabilities presents our individuals have caused for people to live longer. So those are challenges that the government needs to keep up with, and I think has not done as good a job as it needed to. It's only as of late that there's a recognition, because of the outcry of families and the provider community, that the state of New York has failed to adequately fund and keep up with those dollars. And so again, my earlier comments, people need to be vigilant and keep their eye on the prize and not lose sight of how easily that which you think is a guarantee can easily start to disappear. So there are a lot of families who are waiting for an opportunity for a residential spot because they're at an age they can no longer care for their loved one, and they're on a waiting list in some cases. So there's a lot that's gone on over the years, and the state of New York is now just beginning to catch up with the years of neglect, I think. So certainly a recognition on the part of this newest commissioner, but how
And the new
sad that we're
governor.
here. How sad that we're here.
Yeah.
We should never have gotten here.
Well, and as many people have pointed out, it shouldn't just be a bottom line issue. This is about human beings. This is not about, widgets. These are
Absolutely right.
actual people, and there are moral obligations to treat our brothers and sisters with care and love. So to get that into the discussion, to not let it come down to only numbers. I mean, I think you're right that we could talk about it in terms of long-term efficiency. It's a better investment. You get a better return on that investment if from the beginning of a person's life you give them access to healthcare.
Absolutely.
If they live longer, right? There's a lot of things you don't have to deal with, and they're
There's a
much
less strain on the
expensive.
system
Exactly.
down the road. There's
So
less
that's an
interference.
economic argument that we could use, but I think also we don't want to let it become merely an economic conversation, because it is not just an economic conversation. So another question that somebody asked is that in many states, in order for a child to be institutionalized in these kinds of settings, then they would need to terminate parental rights. Could you guys speak a bit about that? Because I do know that that's part of the Gouverneur.
Yeah, that's a horrible thing to even hear.
Yeah.
It still exists. That's a violation of
Yeah.
of a
Essential
natural
human rights.
a natural relationship that no one ever has the right or authority to expect a giving up. But in fact, that's what families had to do.
Yeah.
So that a lot of our individuals became wards of the state of New York. Is really legally the only way in which parents were allowed to place their children during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in terms of institutions like Willowbrook. You gave up your parental rights. And so that to hear and that being raised today just sends chills down my spine, because once Willowbrook closed, thousands of individuals who have family were suddenly without family. And I think part of what the judge Bartels recognized was that those group of people will now have to be represented, and thus the creation of the Consumer
class.
Advisory Board, as
Yeah.
part of the arrangement with the Willowbrook settlement, to represent those who the state of New York made it all too convenient, were able to step away and move out and move on to other states.
Mhm. One thing that's come up in the, I'm sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to bring it up, and maybe this is something for you to respond to. One of the things that's come up in the discussion, in the questions, is about racism within the movement. And I'm thinking about, in this more recent mode where the resources of the family have a direct bearing on the kinds of IEPs and things like that kids can get. Could we talk a bit about that? That system allows for a kind of two-tier system where poorer families who don't have the legal resources, can't hire a lawyer to fight for resources and accommodations for their kids, are basically cut out of the system. And that more well-to-do, predominantly white families can benefit in that system if they know how to use it, if they hire the right consultant who knows how to work in that system. So can we address that? Because I think it's an important part of the conversation that we often don't talk about.
Well, I'm sure Jose has some comments on it from sort of, the professional, right? The professional services delivery, experience. What I'll say is that with regard to some of the comments around, racism within sort of disability universe, let's say, is that's always been an issue from the very beginning. As you were saying, Catherine, scholars have pointed out how parent activism from the very beginning was dominated by white parents, white affluent parents. I'm not talking about white working class, white affluent parents, right? They dominated parent activism for much of the latter part of the 20th century. Gouverneur and the Willowbrook Parents campaign, is sort of a very different story with regards to that.
It's
right?
more inclusive.
At the very least, they were very aware of the population that they were representing, right? These earlier parent activists, and there's some, scholars with us, including Professor Good, who's here, who has discussed, some of these issues, how, these groups, these parents groups did not take race or class into consideration, right? And they deployed a particular image of disabled children as hapless and victims, right? Because unfortunately, pre-World War II, the way the disabled were basically seen as deviant, as criminal, coming from poor backgrounds across all races, right? So the face of disability seems very different pre-World War II. After World War II, there's a real divergence, right, between the way that there is a deployment of images of white middle class children, who are deserving, right, of sympathy and services, and which they were, right. The problem is that there was still some of the old views regarding deviancy and criminality, right, and the fear of mental retardation and criminality in urban slums. There was, it was something that was getting out of control. I have some things in my article coming out from New York State Legislature and some of their studies. They said it's a swamp. It's a swamp that's infested, right? They were using that kind of language to sort of discuss, developmental disability in urban areas. What I'll close is I will say that some of these issues as well in terms of race, and something that you were pointing out, Catherine, sort of privatization of some of these institutions, what some like Dr. Bronston and others have always called the disability industrial complex. It's a real political economic system, right? And one of the most notorious at the moment within the disability rights movement, and many here know it better than I, is the David Rothenberg Center in Boston, who continue to use sort of shock therapy, and parents give away their rights, for children to sort of be corrected their horrible habits, right? What's less known about the David Rothenberg Center in Boston is that they receive a lot of children, Black and Latino children from New York State. New York State pays very, very expensive tuition for these children to be sent to Boston at the David Rothenberg Center.
Right. Jose, do you want to? I didn't want to cut
No,
you off.
I think Jorge touched on all of the points that I would have been making, so I certainly don't have anything further to add.
Okay. Well, we're at 7:45 and we had started at 6:15, so 15 minutes after our normal time. And I feel like we should bring it to a close. But it's so hard to end it. There's many more questions people have about some of the specifics of how it was that it Gouverneur ended up being closed, and it's through that class action that Willie and Goodman had the success in that injunction. But there's many other things. And one of the really interesting questions that came in is the that has to do with Mayor Adams, who made this statement that perhaps it was a mistake to have closed Willowbrook as a completely economic kind of statement, and was schooled in response. But also he himself, he has a learning disability as well. And, you know, how could that be leveraged perhaps to raise people's awareness of what learning disabilities are and are not, and that he could become an important advocate? So that's a really interesting question. I don't know that we can answer that one, but maybe that's something we can keep coming back to, because at the end of this, it's about how do we make this not happen again? How do we fix these problems that are continuing? And how do we not let this happen again? How do we never go back to the Willowbrook or the Gouverneur State School? You know, a school that's not a school.
Mayor Adams' example, as you just described, is I think indicative of the fact that all human beings are precious, and every human being, no matter their level of disability or inabilities, you just don't know what might occur and come out of that human being if
Right.
properly cared for, supported, and assisted.
Yep.
And
Look what he's
that's
accomplished.
our challenge, and that's our charge.
Yeah.
That at the end of the day, my brother, despite all of his limitations, I wanted him to enjoy life to the fullest extent that he can. That's Miss Goodman's goal in life, in exposing Marguerite to everything and anything that she can be exposed to, so that she has a full and rich life. Because you just never know what comes out of that human being if properly nurtured, if properly supported. And Eric
That's right.
Adams is an example of that.
Absolutely.
I wanted to just chime in about Eric Adams. Some of you may be aware, and this is why it's so important to have the community of activists and parents that we have here tonight, that when discussing sort of the homeless issue or housing insecurity in New York, he said, he made the comment, I learned about it after the fact, that that's why places like Willowbrook shouldn't have been closed.
Right.
And it's precisely because of a community of folks that we have here that, were able to push back. And he corrected himself. He had to admit
Right.
that he was wrong, right? He was towing the line once again of, oh, why did they close all of these institutions, right? We should have left them as they were. So
Right.
no,
The snake pits.
the snake pit. That's why
But
it's
I mean, and that was in
important.
response to a moment of mental health crisis. And that's
Right.
not what Willowbrook was either. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Right. Although the reality is that it was such a haphazard institution. I was saying
There were people with
many
mental
people
health
who were
issues.
ending up there that had mental. There really
Absolutely.
no rational, quote unquote. It was irrational on all levels. The
Yeah.
way it sort of managed, right? As it happened. I mean, that's what these.
Right.
If I
Well,
may, just to end
go
the
ahead.
Gouverneur
Yeah.
story on a positive
Yes.
note, the efforts that came about as a result of the injunction that, with the help of Mary Schnapps, led to the eventual collaboration with state officials that identified a place known as Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital, Terrence Connor Cook, and an arrangement with the Mental Retardation Institute at the time in 1979 that allowed for the population of Gouverneur to finally vacate the premises and then move to the next chapter of their lives and be able to get the therapies and the supports, the proper assessments and evaluations to be able to become better suited for smaller community placement opportunities. And then eventually Ms. Goodman's daughter, Margaret, in 1991, left Terrence Connor Cook, former Flower Fifth Avenue, and moved it back into her community. She lives in the same neighborhood that she had to leave when there were no other choices, and is currently living at right across the street from her mother, just around the corner from her mother's place of residence, where she lives now at the age of 66, and along with a few other of the Gouverneur children who still live meaningful lives. So the Gouverneur story ended positively with the help of the community board. Community Board 11 was instrumental in welcoming our individuals. Some were at first opposed because the community felt that, why is our community the one that constantly is being populated with all of these support networks? And thank God for Ms. Goodman says, my child is coming because I live here.
That's
and
right.
my child is going to be turned back. And so that community had to accept someone like a Ms. Goodman because it also recognized it had other individuals in their midst that could also benefit. So the story ended on a good note, because we persisted and we prevailed on behalf of our individuals. My brother's last years were spent in that group home alongside with Margaret Goodman and the other
Yeah.
Gouverneur kids. So he was able to return back to the community he was taken out of back in 1956.
That's so important. Thank you so much for bringing it to that conclusion. I mean, it's, I think, maybe a natural thing that I often look for a happy ending in everything, and not everything has a happy ending, but that is a happy ending. That
They
transition
lived.
into,
They
yeah,
survived.
exactly.
They survived.
Especially when you compare it to the idea that they were being sent just to be warehoused for a couple of years until
To
they
die.
were not a problem anymore. Yeah, that's very powerful, Jose. Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
want to thank our panelists so much, Jorge and Jose, and for being so flexible when we had to change everything at the last moment and everything has been a little bit weird. But I really appreciate all that you've shared with us and the opportunity to hear from the people in the audience, some questions for them. And I want to remind you that we have another event coming in a month. I'm going to ask Nora to come back and to tell people about that.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you so much for a powerful event and really appreciate you spending time with us tonight. And I want to thank the audience for coming again this month. And of course, all the people in the background that are making this event successful.
And
As
thank you for
Catherine-
your patience. Thanks for the patience for the little glitch that we had in the early part. So I'm glad you guys were stick-to-itive so we could do it.
And as Catherine mentioned, we have another event coming up on July 27th. The link is in the chat. The event is called Forget Me Not, Film Viewing and Talk Back about Educational Inclusion. So it's scheduled for July 27th. Please follow us on Eventbrite so you will be able to see our upcoming events, and hope to see you all next month. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.